following is a broadcast of North Burlington Baptist Church.
How are the saints? Good. How are the other ones? So today we're wrapping up a 5-week series we've called Servant Discipleship. And over the last few weeks, we've been looking at questions that are posed to us from God's Word that will help us to draw closer to God and be more intentional in our following of Jesus, which is a process called discipleship. So in week 1, we looked at the very first question that God ever asked humanity, which was, where are you? And it wasn't a geographic question, if you remember. He wasn't looking for where Adam and Eve had hidden themselves geographically. That's why Adam, when he answers, says, I was afraid. It is a question of where his heart was before God that was revealed by his emotional state. And so we explored that a little bit. We said, where's your heart at with God? What's your emotional state? And what might that reveal about where you're at with God? Then week 2, we looked at a question that Jesus asked to a man who was sick, which was this: do you want to get well? And we realized that once we've discovered where we're at with God, that we're not as whole and as well as we'd like to be, the question he wants to ask is, do you want to get well? And we recognize that there is a cost to getting well. There's a cost to beginning a process of moving towards wholeness. And so we looked at that. And then in week 3, we considered a question that Jesus asked his disciples after a large crowd of those who had been following him decided no longer to follow him because, well, his teaching was hard, they said. And he says to the 12, you don't want to leave me too, do you? And we looked at what it would mean to leave Jesus, and we realized that it's possible to leave Jesus in more than one way. That you can leave Jesus and his teachings while still attending church and claiming to be a follower. And then last week, we looked at a rhetorical question that was asked at the end of one of Jesus' parables. And it was, will he thank his servant because he did what he was told? And in this question, Jesus is challenging the attitude of those who serve, who think that they're serving God makes them deserving of his blessing. And especially of those who are in leadership or have been Christians for a while, they can get this sense of entitlement that God owes me, that he should bless me because I've been so good for him. And they don't recognize that actually that's completely the wrong attitude one should have before God. He owes you nothing, but every grace and every goodness and every blessing is really because God is good, not because we're good. Well, today, I want to wrap it up with looking at one last question. I told you it would blow your socks off, if you remember. It's not a question that is posed by Jesus, but it is found on the lips of Jesus because Jesus is telling a story and he's imitating you. Jesus is telling a story, he's imitating you, and he says this is a question that you're going to ask one day. And as I thought about this question, I couldn't help but imagine that when we get to heaven, this will be the one question we'll hear echoing off the walls of heaven more than any other question. It'll be a question that when all heaven is assembled before the throne of God, and all the multitudes of people are there before him, right before they say, worthy is the Lamb, they'll ask this one question. You think you know what it is? Well, before we look at the text, I want to tell you a story I read about. In 1999, Kevin Steffen of Lancaster, New York, was attending his big brother's Little League game. And as one of the players was warming up, he accidentally hit this fellow in his chest, knocked him unconscious, and his heart stopped. Fortunately, in the stands was a nurse whose name was Peggy Brown. She was supposed to have worked that night, but at the last minute, she got the day off. And so she decided to go to her son's Little League game, and this is where the event took place. And she was able to save his life. 7 years later, in January of 2006, Peggy Brown was eating at the Hillview restaurant in Depew, New York, and she began to choke on her food. She said the food wasn't going anywhere. I totally couldn't breathe, said Penny. I was very frightened. Patrons began screaming for help, and from the back of the restaurant, one of the volunteer restaurant employees, who was a volunteer firefighter, ran out, grabbed her from behind, did the Heimlich maneuver, saved her life. After the emergency was over and they had a chance to meet one another, she realized the person who saved her life was, guess who? Absolutely. 17-year-old Kevin Stuff. Amazing, isn't it? It makes you think, what if Penny Brown had never been given that day off those many years earlier? What would happen to that boy's life? What would happen to her life? You see, sometimes we have no idea of the ripple effect that actions will have as they move out into the future and how they may even come back to us. But one day, friends, one day everything is revealed. One day we'll get to see what we never got to see on earth. In Matthew 25, Jesus tells a parable that I suspect is going to be familiar to many of you. Allow me to read it. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he'll put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." When? That will be the question that will echo throughout heaven. When, Lord? When? When were we doing these things for you? You see, when we give our lives to Jesus, he promises that he will use us. And sometimes we may be aware of how he's using us, and sometimes we may never become aware until that day when all things are revealed. A little girl who was a daughter of a missionary couple to the Congo Republic participated in a day-long rally to celebrate the 100th anniversary of missionaries coming to that part of Africa. And at the close of the ceremony, where there had been a lot of long speeches and music, an old man stood up in front of the crowd, and he insisted that he get a chance to speak. He said, "I want a chance to speak before I die, because if I die, there will be information that goes with me to my grave that you need to know about." He said that when the missionaries arrived, his people thought that they were strange and their message was dubious. The tribal leaders decided they would test the missionaries by slowly poisoning them to death. Over a period of months and years, missionary children died one by one. Then the old man said, "It was as we watched how they died that we decided we wanted to live as Christians." Those who died painful, strange death never knew why they were dying or what impact their lives and their deaths would be. But through it all, they didn't leave. They stayed because they trusted in Jesus Christ. Now imagine those missionaries before the throne of God, and he'll be saying to them all that they were doing to reach these people, and they're going to say, "When? When were we used to reach African tribes for you? We only had hardship and death and failure." But they didn't know, friends. They didn't know that in the hardest times, that's when God was at work. Answering the prayer that they had prayed probably the most of any prayer. God, use us to reach these people with your love. Friends, could it be that God is using us in ways that we will never imagine and that we may never know until that day when all things are revealed? You see, our small acts of obedience that we think do nothing, those sacrifices that seem so costly now and we think have so little return, what if God is creating a chain of events? Nene Hammond is the executive editor of a newspaper called the Southeast Outlook in Louisville, Kentucky. But in 1988, she worked as a reporter for a small newspaper in Lebanon, Kentucky. And on May 14th of that year, newspapers throughout the country carried a story of a bus crash where 24 children and 3 adults died. It was called the worst drunk driving accident in Kentucky history. And that bus carried a group of youth from First Assembly Church of God in Radcliffe, Kentucky. And though Nene herself didn't cover these stories, many of her friends did, and a lot of reporters from the county from where these kids were from. Witnesses who survived the crash told of one particular passenger. His name was Chuck Kaida. He was the youth minister of the church. Chuck was seated in the front of the bus behind the driver, and when the gas tank exploded, a heartbeat after the collision, he was instantly encircled in flames. When Chuck saw the flames around him, witnesses say, he looked up, he lifted his hands, and he cried out, "Jesus, I'm coming home." And they said he was smiling. Nene wrote, I was not a Christian in 1988, so I couldn't make sense of what Chuck did. Here's this guy so cool, the kids call him Banana. And he's in flames, moments away from a horrible death, and he's smiling. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't erase from her mind the image of Chuck. And Nene wrote, the only way to explain how a man could calmly accept, almost welcome a painful death, was to acknowledge that he understood some great truth that I didn't. That he had something, faith, hope, God maybe, something I don't know. And try as I might, I couldn't help yearning for whatever he had that made death a thing to embrace rather than a thing to fear. 2 years later, Nene would come to Christ, and she said Chuck Kaida planted a seed in me that took root in my heart. One day I'll see Chuck in heaven, and I'll tell him how the manner of his death pointed me towards eternity. When? He'll say. When did I ever have influence on you? Rick Stearns, the president of World Vision, calls it the domino theory of spiritual impact. He says, imagine a line of dominoes, and when one falls, it stands in a chain reaction that causes dozens of dominoes to keep falling. For instance, Jesus set up 12 dominoes, he says, the 12 apostles. He mentored them, he empowered them with his Holy Spirit, and then he sent them off to go and do likewise. And now over 2 million people claim to be followers of Jesus Christ. That's a lot of dominoes, friends. In 1880, Robert Wilder was a missionary kid from India, and he was preparing to return to the mission field during college. He even signed a pledge saying he was going to go to the mission field, but because he was so physically frail, he was never able to fulfill that pledge. And so instead, he took up a challenge to encourage others to go onto the mission field. Instead of giving up, he persevered, and one domino fell. And during his preaching tour, it took him through Chicago, and he spoke to an audience that included a fellow named Samuel Moffett. And Moffett also signed that pledge, and within 2 years, he landed in Korea. Another domino had fallen. A few years later, Samuel shared the gospel with a man who had become disillusioned with a Taoist practice named Keel Sun Chu, who trusted Christ. And another domino fell. In 1907, Keel was one of the leaders in the Pyongyang revival. And in January of that year, spontaneous prayer and confession broke out in regular church meetings. Thousands of dominoes fell at that time. There is fervent prayer that's now considered the birth of the independent, self-sustaining Korean church. And when he died in 1935, 5,000 people attended his funeral. The church in Korea now numbers 15 million, and it sends more missionaries than any other country outside the United States. 1 million of dominoes continue to fall. See, as Christians, we're all dominoes in a chain reaction set off by Jesus 2,000 years ago. And the amazing thing about dominoes falling is the chain reaction always starts small, with just one willing to lay down their life. A seemingly insignificant domino. And yet they have no idea what kind of big impact their life will bring as God multiplies their faithfulness generation to generation. See, friends, what I'm trying to help you to understand, what I really, really want to impress upon you, is that when we make tough choices to be obedient, when we fully engage our discipleship process that Jesus calls us to, when we lay down our lives and surrender our wills and submit to his leadership, even when it's hard and we don't understand what he could possibly be doing, he uses us. And one day we'll find out how. In the ancient catacombs of Rome, they found preserved a story, a true story, of a man named Paulus. A rich man named Proculus. He had hundreds of slaves, but this slave named Paulus was so trustworthy that he made him a steward over all his household. One day, Proculus took Paulus with him to the slave market to buy some new workers. Before the bargaining began, they examined the men to see if they were strong and healthy. Among the slaves stood a weak old man, and Paulus urged his owner to buy this slave. Proculus answered, "But he's good for nothing." "Go ahead, buy him," Paulus insisted. "He's cheap, and I promise that the work in your household will get done even better than before." So Proculus agreed and purchased the elderly slave, and Paulus made good on his word. The work went better than ever. But Proculus observed that Paulus now worked for the two men. The old slave did no work at all, while Paulus tended to him, gave him the best food, and made him rest. Proculus was curious, so he confronted Paulus. "Who is this slave? You know I value you. I don't mind you protecting this old man, but tell me who he is. Is he your father who has fallen into slavery?" Paulus answered, "It's someone to whom I owe more than to my own father." "Your teacher, then?" "No, somebody to whom I owe even more." "Who then?" "This is my enemy." "Your enemy?" "Yes, he's the man who killed my father and sold us, the children, as slaves." Proculus stood speechless. "As for me," said Paulus, "I am a disciple of Jesus Christ. And he has taught me to love our enemies and to reward evil with good." What kind of a man was this guy? For one miserable old man, he's going to pour out his life, but he didn't know. You see, he didn't know that hundreds of years later, the stories of his faithfulness and sacrifice would be told to people and encourage people, Christians, in a part of the world that hadn't even been discovered at that time. But God used him and still uses him by allowing people like me to tell his story to encourage people like you in ways that he would have never dreamt of. And when he's standing before Christ and he's told that his act of obedience encouraged believers in Burlington hundreds of years later, he'll look like, what? When? When was I ever used to do that? You see, friends, the answer to when that Christ gives is every time we live out our faith. Every time we share the practical implications of our faith with others. That's when we minister to Christ. And we do more than we ever thought we could imagine. And when we obey, even when we don't understand, when we do what in our own flesh we would never do, simply because we have committed our lives to being his servants, that's when God is able to do what we would have never thought he was able to do through us. And in one day, it's going to be revealed. And because God asks hard questions of his disciples today, when we find out all that he's able to accomplish through our obedience, we can ask him that one question that many others will be asking too. When? When? Every time we're obedient, every time we sacrifice, every time we do what we know God is calling us to do, even if we don't understand why.
There's a true story of a small village in India. And in this village, there was this family that came to a saving faith in Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. This agitated the village so much, and everybody became so upset that an angry mob gathered and shoved them into the public square. The village chief confronted them, and he said to the man, "If you and your family will not recant your faith, you all will surely die." The man didn't know what to say or what to do. And so the only thing that came to mind for him were the words of a song that he himself had composed when he had first surrendered his life to God. And so he began to sing, "I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back." And with that, horrifically, his children were killed.
I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back.
He was given another chance, this time with his wife's life on the line. And yet he continued to sing, "Though none go with me, still I will follow. No turning back, no turning back."
Though none go with me, still I will follow. Though none go with me, still I will follow. Though none go with me, still I will follow. No turning back, no turning back.
After her tragic death, he was given one final opportunity, this time to save himself. And yet he continued to sing.
Cross before me, the world behind me. The cross before me, the world behind me. The cross before me, the world behind me. No turning back, no turning back.
Even though that man and his family died on that day, something remarkable happened. A seed was planted in the heart of that village chief, a seed that began to grow over time, and eventually he called the community together in that very same neighborhood, in that very same square, and he renounced his former faith and declared his allegiance to Jesus Christ. And a celebration broke out in that moment, and the gospel began to flourish and to grow in that community, not just in that village, but across the whole region, because they had seen real faith, and they knew the true character of God because of a family that believed and sacrificed, even under the penalty of death.
No turning back. No turning back.
So, and I know some of you are wondering about, we did the Halloween thing with the kids. Remember we heard there was a big storm coming, And so we decided to hold it indoors, and we had a ton of volunteers. All 10 of the kids that came got a lot of candy. Now, I know what you're thinking. I was thinking this too. Oh, well, I guess it was a failure. You see, just 10 kids came. Most of them already are connected to the church. There's one little girl who was new. One little girl who said she might come to kids club now because she had fun. But God can't just use one little girl anyways, can he? He wouldn't take a church, invest time with 10 volunteers and spend money on candy for one little girl, would he? I mean, what after all could one little girl do? One day we'll find out, friends. One day we'll find out. Some of you are facing decisions right now, and you're saying, I don't feel like doing this. You're being asked to put away things that you don't want to put away. It could be anger and bitterness, and you love the feel that it gives you because you love being angry. But Jesus said, it's time to put it away. And you don't know what that one act of obedience will do as it ripples down through history. Some of you are facing a decision where you know the right thing and you know the wrong thing and you don't feel like it, but Jesus says, will you follow me? And one day you'll find out what will come of that act of obedience or disobedience. Friends, I don't know about you, but I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No turning back. This week, friends, make a decision that will ripple through all of eternity. Follow him wherever he leads.
This podcast is a service of North Burlington Baptist Church. If you have any questions or comments, you can email us at info@nbbc.ca. You can also find more information about us at www.nbbc.ca.